It's time to move along to 1986 on this 17th episode of Good Nintentions. Considering it was nothing more than a chronological rundown of games released alongside the Nintendo Entertainment System in October of 1985, Good Nintentions 1985 offered a surprisingly compelling narrative arc. We watched as Nintendo went from green developer to unwanted contender in the US console market to purveyors of a grassroots launch campaign powered by a robot toy and the single most impressive console game ever released to that point. 1986, on the other hand, will encompass a more modest tale. Nintendo's full rollout into the national US market, the second set of first-party NES launch titles, and ultimately, the late-year arrival of third parties culminating in a single worthwhile release by a publisher besides Nintendo. Before we get into Good Intentions 1986 proper, we have two pieces of housekeeping to take care of. Namely, Donkey Kong Jr. Math and Mach Rider. I refer to these as housekeeping because I wasn't really sure whether to class them as 1985 games or 1986. They exist in a state of quantum uncertainty. Officially, Nintendo categorizes them as 1985 releases, but Nintendo's official listings for NES games can often be suspect. The company's own NES release data omits official releases for games whose publishers later went rogue. Specifically, Tengen published several titles under Nintendo's license in 1987, including Pac-Man, but Nintendo doesn't officially recognize Pac-Man as having shown up on the American NES until 1993, when Namco repatriated with Nintendo as a licensee and reissued Tengen's game. I've also found a few instances where I know firsthand that Nintendo's dates aren't quite right. For example, they list Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, as having launched in December of 1990, but I bought the game the day after Thanksgiving that year, which was November 23rd. The reality is, game distribution in the US was a lot looser and less obsessively documented in the NES era than it is now, with release dates slipping around due to the vagaries of toy distribution, which is how retailers classified video games in the 80s and into the 90s. And Nintendo itself didn't help with its own inconsistencies. For example, Zelda 2's official US release date ended up slipping to December 1988 due to chip manufacturing shortages, but several reliable sources have indicated the game did show up in America months before that in extremely tiny quantities. So who knows? In short, Nintendo's official NES game release documentation should be absorbed with a grain of salt, their guidelines seemingly written to the best of people's ability based on available info rather than gospel truth. Which brings us to Donkey Kong Jr. Math and Mach Rider. Nintendo claims both games launched aside the NES in 1985, but again, I've come across several reliable external sources through the years that have indicated they didn't. Given the bootstrapped nature of the NES's initial holiday release, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that Nintendo's data could be somewhat off the mark here. Or perhaps a few copies of those games did ship in vanishingly small quantities on day one, only to resurface properly 8 months later when the console went nationwide. I realize this all seems like a lot of pointless nitpicking. I mean, who really cares about Donkey Kong Jr. Math, right? But the uncertainty over these games, with eyewitness accounts and research contradicting Nintendo's formal documentation, speaks volumes about the ramshackle nature of the American console market at the time of the NES's debut. And it speaks as well to the difficulty of documenting the ins and outs of the medium's formative days, a frustration documented by game historians like Frank Cifaldi. So I'm grouping Donkey Kong Jr. Math and Mach Rider as 1986 games, even if Nintendo says otherwise. Not that it probably matters, Donkey Kong Jr. Math isn't particularly good now, and it wasn't particularly enjoyable back then, either. As the title indicates, Donkey Kong Jr. Math attempts to showcase the edutainment potential of the NES by repurposing graphics from the console's rendition of Donkey Kong Jr. We'll look at DK Jr. itself in a few episodes, which highlights another oddity of the NES launch. According to Nintendo's info, they released this bastardization of one of their keystone creations in America before the original work itself. Truth be told, there's very little interesting about Donkey Kong Jr. Math itself, at least as a game. It offers 3 modes of play: Calculate A, Calculate B, and Operator Exercise, all of which concern Junior creating sums by climbing vines and chains. Calculate A and B are simply 2 different difficulty levels for the same basic mode, which sees Junior climbing vines to create sums. Donkey Kong holds up a sign with a numeric figure on it, and your task is to grab numbers and mathematical operators to reach that sum. Mode B is the more difficult of the two because you have to deal with larger figures and negative numbers, but otherwise the 2 modes are identical. According to the manual, this can be played either solo or competitively, but the manual, I'm afraid, is a load of bunk. There's no demarcation between solo and multiplayer here. Every time you play, it's presented as a head-to-head contest, with player 1 controlling a normal version of Junior, and player 2 controlling his pink counterpart. You don't have to go up against another player, but the game is pointless without that element of competition. Donkey Kong Jr. Math reminds me a great deal of Stack Up in this regard. It feels like the beginning of an actual game that the developers never quite got around to finishing. The single-player mode literally consists of playing the competitive game without a competitor, which is frankly not worth doing. Operator Exercise feels slightly less pointless in that it's strictly a single-player endeavor and doesn't come off as incomplete without a second person to join in. So that's something in its favor, at least. This mode takes place in the final stage of Donkey Kong Jr., with a row of chains descending from the ceiling. You begin by choosing the nature of the exercise, ranging from large sums to simple multiplication and division tasks, and complete 10 consecutive challenges. The controls here are a little confusing and annoyingly change up slightly depending on your chosen operator, but basically each chain connects to a different part of the target sum, the ones, the tens, the hundreds, etc., and you slide Junior up or down the chain to set a number for that position. Once you've set the entire sum, you drop off the chain and see whether you were right or wrong. And that's about it. This is a bare-bones education game, enormously less entertaining than something like, say, Math Blasters or the Oregon Trail. Nintendo designated Donkey Kong Jr. Math as part of the Education series of NES games, but as I mentioned in my look at 1983's Famicom releases, the word series is a serious misnomer. This was the only game to belong to that series. And Nintendo barely even sold it. Like fellow not quite complete NES launch title Stack Up, it seemingly came into being more to fill out the roster and provide some flimsy justification for the console, as in, look, the NES was educational too, than to be a product in its own right. It's by far the rarest NES black box title, with boxed complete copies selling in the neighborhood of $1,000 these days. In a way, it's amazing that Donkey Kong Jr. Math came to America at all. It feels like a relic of the system's days before the American launch, that initial attempt to turn the console into a modular home computer that was scuttled long before it ever reached retail. More to the point, it's a product of the very earliest days of the Famicom, when Nintendo had the daunting task before them of marketing their very own console and providing a full lineup of software for it, despite having very little in-house experience with game development. The Famicom launched with 3 games, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye, and Nintendo padded out its early Japanese lineup by turning all 3 of those titles into educational releases. This is not a figure of speech. Donkey Kong Jr. Math is literally built from components of Donkey Kong Jr. In fact, the website The Cutting Room Floor indicates that the code is littered with unused element from the original game, and the material that does appear in-game, from sprites to audio effects, that's all directly adapted from Donkey Kong Jr. The same is true of the other Japanese education series release, Popeye no Eigo Asobi. One has to wonder if the third planned title in the series, in which Donkey Kong would tutor kids in music, ended up being scuttled because it was going to feature too many original sprites and material to justify its development costs. Who knows? In any case, Nintendo needed a cheap way to recycle assets to flesh out its 1983 Famicom release schedule, and Donkey Kong Jr. Math was one of the results. It truly does feel like precisely the slapdash creation it is. One of its 2 game modes lacks a proper single-player play format, and neither mode feels especially refined or interesting. It's a curiosity at best, a historical relic of Nintendo's early days when they hadn't yet landed on the concept of quality and polish as the primary distinguishing trait of their software. The one advantage Donkey Kong Jr. Math has over its partner in crummy half-finished black box rarities, Stack Up, is that gamers can at least slake their curiosity about its lousiness without too much difficulty or cost. Where Stack Up requires Rob, a working NES, a CRT television, and a small fleet of plastic doodads in order for its uselessness to come into full focus, Donkey Kong Jr. Math has shown up on several iterations of Virtual Console, so you can soak up its mediocrity for just a few bucks. Not that it's worth even that much, but $4.99 sure beats dropping 4 figures on a miserable cartridge and a few ounces of cardboard and paper. Collectors, it's not worth it. Turn back before it's too late. Donkey Kong Jr. Math may be an educational title, but the most important lesson it has to offer today is that subtracting a large sum from your bank account for the sake of completism adds up to nothing but sadness. Next on Good Nintentions, we collapse the waveform on that other Quantum Launch title.